Welcome back, friends. I'm back with another fantastic science fiction story. In this episode, we'll be listening to the adventurous story of Oliver and Valentina. Sit back and get ready to dive into the adventure. Enjoy watching. The Grand Assembly Hall of Arrows 7 had been carved from a single asteroid 3,000 years ago by a civilization that no longer existed, which Oliver found both architecturally impressive and philosophically troubling. The builders had shaped the interior into a perfect rotunda, 700 meters across, with tiered galleries rising in concentric rings toward a domed ceiling through which, on clear orbital cycles, you could see the twin moons of the Velthari sovereignty hanging like cold lamps in the black. The asteroid itself drifted in the neutral gravitational corridor between three contested systems, belonging to no one, which was the only reason anyone had agreed to meet here at all. Neutral ground, in Oliver's experience, meant a place where everyone was equally uncomfortable, which was apparently the necessary prerequisite for diplomacy. He had been sitting in the same chair for 6 days. It was a Velthari chair, designed for a species whose spine was composed of 9 vertebral clusters rather than the human 33. And every hour spent in it registered somewhere between mild discomfort and geological suffering. He had submitted a formal request on day 2 for a human-compatible alternative. The response arrived via the hall's administrative node, an artificial intelligence that communicated exclusively through color-coded status indicators and gentle chimes. And it was, in the AI's understated visual language, the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. Oliver was 31 years old and had been selected for this posting primarily, he suspected, because the 2 people ranked above him in Earth's delegation had developed what the Velthari physicians called resonance fatigue, and what Petra, his advisor, described more accurately as the completely understandable desire to stop doing this. He held the rank of junior attaché, which in the intergalactic diplomatic framework was so minor a designation that most translation algorithms rendered it simply as also present. He had spent 4 years studying interstellar law, non-human political theory, and 6 alien languages, none of which had yet proven useful, because Urath, the Kale Confederation's senior delegate, conducted his arguments in a subsonic frequency range that rattled Oliver's back teeth regardless of what language the tone translator claimed it was technically occurring in. The hall smelled of ozone and recycled atmosphere, and something faintly floral he had eventually traced to the Velthari ceremonial candles burning in amber housings along the inner walls. Those candles had not been extinguished in 3,000 years. They had outlasted the civilization that built the hall, survived 17 documented interstellar conflicts, witnessed 412 formal diplomatic sessions, and still managed to make the rotunda feel faintly like the lobby of a very ancient, very exclusive hotel, in which no one was entirely certain they were welcome. He had been watching Queen Valentina for 6 days, and was not proud of it. She sat at the highest point of the circular chamber on a throne constructed, according to his pre-mission briefing files, from compressed dark matter stabilized by a process the Velthari had declined to share with any other civilization, less out of secrecy than because no other civilization had yet asked in a manner suggesting they would use the answer responsibly. She had not spoken once since the negotiations began. She observed everything with a quality of stillness that was not passivity but something more deliberate, the way a person watches a fire to understand it rather than to be warmed by it. She wore robes of dark starsilk, a Velthari textile that absorbed light at certain wavelengths and emitted it faintly at others, so that in the amber candlelight she seemed to carry a quiet luminescence entirely her own. In every way Oliver could perceive, she looked like a human woman. There was only the matter of her ears, long, elegantly tapered, rising from beneath dark hair the way ancient Earth stories had always drawn their elves, as if someone had once read those stories and quietly decided they were describing something real. He had tried not to find this remarkable. He had failed at this consistently and without exception, much like he had failed to find a comfortable position in his chair, which was to say completely. Day 6 arrived with the quality of a morning that had already decided how it would end. The Kale delegation introduced 11 new procedural objections before the second hour was out. Urath's tone translator malfunctioned twice in quick succession, briefly rendering his formal statements as detailed culinary recommendations, which produced the only genuine laughter the chamber had heard all week before the hall's technical crew corrected the fault and returned everyone to their scheduled misery. Petra had pressed a data slate into Oliver's hand with 4 words on the screen. "We are done here." He looked at it. He looked at Valentina, at her composed and motionless expression, at the amber light touching the fine edges of her ears. He felt, in a way he had no professional language for, and certainly no approved protocol to address, that it was profoundly unfair to have found someone that interesting in a room he was about to leave forever. Then Urath declared the Velthari Treaty terms an insult to the cosmic order, which caused the room to come apart completely. 1,000 voices from 100 worlds filled the rotunda at once. Oliver's translation implants, overwhelmed past their operating threshold, began generating what could only be described as impressionist poetry. The dust of honor will not sit beside the shame-claimed star, and somewhere inside the wall of sound, Petra was saying something to him that he could not hear. He was already standing. He had no notes. He had no plan. He had 3 cups of Velthari ceremonial tea metabolizing at speed through his system, and one idea so catastrophically stupid that it had lapped all the way back around to feeling inevitable. "Who wants to marry me?" he shouted. The silence came down like a door closing on the entire universe. 1,000 delegates from 100 worlds held their silence with the collective discipline of people who understood, at some deep and wordless level, that something was happening that did not yet have a name. Oliver stood in the amber light of the rotunda with his mouth still open, and the reverb of his own voice dying somewhere in the stone above him. And he thought, with the focused clarity that only genuine catastrophe can produce, that this was considerably worse than the time he had confused the Velthari gesture for greeting with the one that meant territorial challenge, and nearly ended an entire trade summit in under 4 minutes. At least then he could blame the briefing materials. This he had done entirely on his own, without notes, without precedent, and without any conceivable diplomatic exit. The silence stretched another full second. Then 2. Then Petra made a sound beside him that was not quite a word, and not quite a noise, but existed somewhere in the frequency range of a person watching a perfectly avoidable disaster in perfect slow motion. And then Queen Valentina rose from her throne. She did not stand the way a person stands when startled. She did not stand the way a person stands when amused. She rose the way a tide rises, not with urgency, not with spectacle, but with the absolute untroubled certainty of something that has decided to happen. The dark starsilk of her robes moved with her, and the amber lanterns caught the long tapered edges of her ears, and for one suspended moment the entire chamber seemed to recalibrate around her, the way a room recalibrates when a window opens and the air reminds everyone that there is an outside. She looked at Oliver across the full diameter of the rotunda with eyes that were dark and still and entirely unreadable. And then, in a voice that was not loud, that was, in fact, very nearly quiet, she said one word. "Me." The word landed in the chamber with the weight of something much longer. It required no translation. Every implant in every ear rendered it identically, because some things do not benefit from interpretation. The delegates nearest the Velthari throne turned first, then the ones below them, then the next tier, and the next, one concentric ring of 1,000 faces pivoting in sequence, until every pair of eyes in the rotunda had completed the journey from Valentina to Oliver, and arrived at their destination simultaneously. Oliver sat down. He did not decide to sit down. His legs made the decision without consulting him, which he felt was reasonable under the circumstances, because his legs had a more accurate read on the situation than the part of his brain still trying to argue that this was fine and manageable and could be addressed through careful language. The chair received him with its customary hostility. He barely noticed. "Oliver." Petra's voice arrived close to his ear, very low and very deliberate, the tone she used when she was exercising what she would later describe as heroic self-restraint. "Tell me, and I am asking sincerely, as your advisor and as a person who would like to continue having a career, that what just occurred was a documented Earth negotiation technique that you failed to brief me on this morning." "It was a joke," Oliver said. There was a silence from Petra that was architecturally different from the one that had just filled the chamber. It was smaller and more personal and in some ways more frightening. "It was a joke," she said. "A rhetorical," she answered Oliver. "I noticed, the Queen of the Velthari sovereignty, who has not spoken in 6 days, who commands a fleet that spans 4 star systems. She answered your joke." "I'm aware of what happened, Petra." "Just making sure," Petra said, "because you have the expression of someone who isn't entirely sure what planet they're on." Around them the rotunda had not returned to argument. This was itself unprecedented. In 6 days of collapsed negotiations, the hall had never once been quiet voluntarily. Quiet had only existed in the spaces between one grievance ending and the next beginning. But now the 1,000 delegates sat in something that was not the silence of shock, but the silence of people watching a situation they had not been issued a script for, and finding, perhaps for the first time in 6 days, that they were genuinely curious how it would resolve. Urath's tone translator emitted a single low sound that the implants rendered as procedural concern, which Oliver gathered was the Kale equivalent of staring with one's mouth open, adapted for a being with no discernible mouth. 3 delegates from the Rail Protectorate were already transmitting something on their communication devices, using a data compression format so advanced that it could only be live archival documentation, which meant that what had just happened was being stored in the Rail historical record in real time, which was either an enormous honor or an enormous problem, and Oliver strongly suspected it was both. Valentina had not yet sat down. She stood at the height of the chamber, unhurried, watching him in the amber light, and her expression remained what it had been since the first day, not closed exactly, but private, the way certain books look before you open them. Oliver straightened in his chair with the careful dignity of a man trying to reassemble himself under direct observation. He smoothed the front of his jacket. He looked at the data slate on the table before him, which still displayed Petra's 4 words, "We are done here," and thought that this particular assessment now required revision. 2 Velthari attendants appeared at his side with the silent efficiency of people who had been briefed on a situation he had not yet been told about, and one of them inclined their head toward the corridor at the chamber's eastern arc. "The Queen," the attendant said, "will see you now." The anteroom was smaller than Oliver had expected for a space adjacent to a chamber designed to hold 1,000 beings, and it had the quality of a room that had witnessed a great many conversations that mattered. The walls were the same asteroid-carved gray as the rotunda, but here the amber lanterns were fewer, and the light they cast was quieter and somehow more direct. The way candlelight is always more honest than a chandelier. He sat in a chair that, for the first time in 6 days, was designed for a human spine, which he found suspicious. The 2 Velthari attendants had brought him here with the courteous efficiency of people operating on instructions prepared in advance, which meant Valentina had arranged this room before he had done what he did in the chamber, which meant either she had anticipated him specifically, or she maintained an anteroom equipped for human anatomical comfort as a general diplomatic courtesy, and he was not yet certain which possibility unsettled him more. The attendants left. Oliver looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was very old and had nothing useful to say. He looked at his hands. He looked at the door. Valentina entered alone. She had removed the outer ceremonial layer of her starsilk robes, which made her look, paradoxically, more rather than less composed, as though the formal garments had been armor she had simply chosen not to need. She crossed the room and sat across from him at the small stone table with the ease of someone settling into a conversation they had already decided not to find difficult. Oliver opened his mouth. "I want to explain," he said, "that what happened in the chamber was not a formal statement. It was not made under any recognized diplomatic protocol. It falls entirely outside Earth's negotiation framework, and I want to be clear that my government has not and would not sanction." "You are explaining that it was a joke," Valentina said. "Yes, I know." Oliver blinked. "You know." "Yes. You know it was a joke, and you still." "Yes." He sat with this for a moment. Outside, the muffled acoustic weight of 1,000 delegates rearranging themselves transmitted faintly through the stone, and somewhere in that murmur was almost certainly Petra, writing an emergency report with the focused fury of someone who had decided that documentation was the only thing standing between her and complete professional collapse. "With respect," Oliver said carefully, "most people, when they know something is a joke, do not answer it." Valentina looked at him with an expression that had not changed since she entered the room, and he was beginning to understand that this was not blankness but precision, that she communicated through small things rather than large ones, and that he needed to recalibrate the scale he was reading her on. "In Velthari," she said, "there is a concept, Velthas." She said the word as a single soft thing. It translates most accurately as the honest accident, the thing said without calculation. We consider it among the most reliable forms of communication available to any speaking being, because it has not been filtered through intention. You said something without planning it. That is the only reason I listened to it. But Oliver absorbed this, so if I had stood up and delivered a prepared speech, I would have heard another prepared speech, she said. We have had 6 days of prepared speeches. They have been very thorough and entirely useless. But there was something in the way she said this, a dryness so precise it was almost invisible, that reminded him suddenly and unexpectedly of his grandmother, who had also been capable of reducing catastrophe to 4 words with the calm of someone filing a routine report. He felt the back of his neck relax in a way it had not in 6 days. "I have to ask," he said, "when you answered, was that a Velthas? Were you saying something you hadn't planned?" But she considered this with the same quality of attention she gave everything. "No," she said, "so you planned it." "I considered it for approximately 2 seconds. That's still faster than most policy decisions." "But most policy decisions," Valentina said, "are made by committees." She said the word committees the way a person says the word whether when they mean inevitable, unpleasant, and nobody's specific fault. Oliver laughed. It arrived before he had evaluated whether it was appropriate, which made it, he supposed, a Velthas of its own, and he saw something shift very slightly in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the negative space where a smile had recently considered being. He learned things about her in the hour that followed the way you learn a landscape when the light changes, not all at once, not through announcement, but through accumulation. She had been 19 when she assumed the Velthari throne, following the death of her predecessor during a border conflict with the Kale that had never been formally resolved, which was why she was here. She had ruled for 311 years, which was possible because Velthari cellular regeneration operated on a cycle that Oliver's human biology would have found profoundly unfair. She had read Earth literature for 60 years, initially as a diplomatic exercise and eventually because she had run out of reasons to stop. When she mentioned, almost incidentally, that she found the narrative tradition of the unnecessary epilogue to be a form of institutional cowardice, Oliver felt something in the general area of his chest do something he would need to examine later, in private, when no one was watching. "You have been watching me," she said, which was not a question. "I've been watching the proceedings," Oliver said. She looked at him with the particular patience of someone waiting for a person to catch up to something they already know. "Yes," he said. "I've been watching you. For 6 days." To be fair, the negotiations were not offering much competition. The negative space where a smile had recently considered being moved, this time, considerably closer to its destination. Outside, in the great rotunda, the amber lanterns continued their 3,000-year vigil, and 1,000 delegates sat with the restless energy of people who had arrived expecting a war and were beginning to suspect, without any official confirmation, that they might be witnessing something else entirely. The walk back to the main chamber lasted approximately 40 seconds and felt considerably longer, the way all journeys feel longer when you are not entirely certain whether you are returning to a negotiation or a wedding. The attendants escorted Oliver from the anteroom with the same quiet efficiency with which they had brought him there, and when the great doors of the rotunda opened again, and 1,000 pairs of eyes rotated toward him with the synchronized precision of a single organism that had been waiting with genuine interest, he understood two things simultaneously: that Petra was going to say something to him, and that whatever she said was going to be deeply accurate. 17, she said when he reached his seat. "I'm sorry." "Urath," Petra said, pressing a data slate into his hands without looking at it, her eyes fixed on the Kale delegation with the expression of a person watching a natural disaster proceeding exactly on schedule. "While you were in there, Urath filed 17 formal procedural objections to the proposed union. 17. He did them alphabetically. The first concerns cosmic jurisdictional precedent. The last one is about chairs." Oliver looked at the data slate. The objections were listed in clean Kale administrative script, translated in real time by the Hall's central processing node. Objection 14, he noted, concerned the nutritional incompatibility of human and Velthari ceremonial food traditions, and was 3 pages long. "He wrote 3 pages about food," Oliver said. "He is very thorough," Petra said, "also very afraid." This was the most strategically significant thing Petra had said in 6 days, and she delivered it the way she delivered most strategically significant things, as though it were obvious, which in retrospect it always was. Urath was afraid. The Kale Confederation's border claims rested entirely on the absence of a formal Velthari peace alliance, and a union, even an accidental, unprecedented, cosmically irregular one between a junior human attaché and the Velthari queen, represented the specific shape of everything the Kale had spent 3 sessions trying to prevent. 17 procedural objections was not opposition so much as panic wearing a bureaucratic coat. Oliver set the data slate down. Across the chamber, Urath's tone translator was emitting a sustained low register that the implants rendered as procedural urgency, which Oliver was coming to understand, meant that Urath was talking very fast and very insistently about things that did not matter in order to prevent anyone from talking about the things that did. 3 delegates from the Rail Protectorate were recording the session through devices that harvested light data at the quantum level, building an archival record so precise it could theoretically reconstruct the room from any single moment to within 4 milliseconds. They were pointed, Oliver noticed, primarily at him. Then his personal comm unit vibrated, then again, then 4 times in rapid succession, with a particular pattern that indicated a priority transmission from Earth's Foreign Affairs Office, which meant that Petra's emergency report had crossed the quantum relay and arrived on the desk of someone with authority, who had briefed someone with more authority, and the information had climbed the chain of command responsible for situations without existing protocol, until it reached a level at which the appropriate response was to contact Oliver directly and with great urgency. The message read, "Please clarify, is the Oliver situation political or personal or both, and either way is THERE paperwork." He read it twice. He turned the comm unit so Petra could see it. "That took 11 minutes to cross 4 light years," she said, "and that's what they did with the time." "Oliver," Petra sat down beside him, which was unusual, because she habitually stood during sessions as a physical expression of professional readiness. The fact that she sat meant something had shifted in her assessment of what readiness looked like. What is actually happening, the real thing, not the version I write in the report. He thought about the anteroom, about Velthas, and what it meant to say something true without intending to. About the way Valentina said committees as though it were a medical condition. About the hour he had spent in that small stone room discovering who she was and finding the answer larger and stranger and more interesting than the person he had already found entirely too compelling from across a rotunda. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said in 4 years of diplomatic work, and therefore the most unsettling. Petra studied him for a long moment with the expression she reserved for situations that had exceeded her job description by a significant margin. Then she nodded once, with the decisive quality of someone who has weighed an impossible situation, and concluded that the only option is to proceed through it and see what's on the other side. "Then figure it out," she said. "Before Urath finishes objection 11, he submits fast." Above them, in the high galleries, the delegates of 100 worlds watched with the collective attention of beings who had arrived expecting a failed negotiation, and were being offered something they had no category for. The amber lanterns burned their 3,000-year light across all of it without comment. At the highest point of the chamber, Valentina had returned to her throne, and she sat with the composed stillness she always had, but Oliver, who had now spent an hour in a room with her learning to read the smaller scale of her expressions, could see something in the set of her shoulders that had not been there this morning. She was waiting, not with patience. Patience was passive, and there was nothing passive in her stillness. She was waiting the way a person waits when they have already decided what they are hoping for and are simply watching to see whether the universe will be reasonable about it. Oliver looked at the data slate and its 17 objections. He looked at the comm unit waiting for clarification on the paperwork situation. He looked at Petra, who had the expression of someone standing at the precise edge of a moment that was going to resolve one way or another, and had elected to stay and see which. Then he looked at Valentina, and he understood, with the slow and inconvenient certainty of something that has been true for longer than you admitted it, that the only thing left was to mean it. Urath's objections were read aloud by the hall's central administrative intelligence, which announced each one in a voice of perfect, serene neutrality that managed to make 17 acts of procedural desperation sound like a reasonable way to spend an afternoon. The intelligence had been running the hall's formal proceedings for 900 years, and had never, in all that time, been given cause to editorialize, which Oliver considered a significant institutional failing, because editorializing would have been extremely useful right now. Objection 1 concerned cosmic jurisdictional precedent, and whether a union between a citizen of a non-sovereignty world and a Velthari sovereign could be considered legally binding under the Interstellar Compact of Eros, a document last revised 200 years before Earth had achieved spaceflight, and which contained, in its 4th supplementary annex, a subclause so ancient it was written in a language 3 of the hall's translation systems, rendered as corrupted data. Objection 5 concerned the symbolic implications for Kale territorial claims under the Neutral Corridor Agreement, which was the one that actually mattered, and which Urath had buried in the middle of the list with the instincts of someone who hoped nobody would notice, except that everyone noticed, because everyone had been awake for 6 days and had very little else to focus on. Objection 9 concerned the chairs. It was 4 sentences long, which Oliver respected in a grim and reluctant way. By objection 11, the Rail Protectorate delegates had stopped archiving and started talking amongst themselves in low tones that their translation dampeners were not quite containing. By objection 13, 2 delegates from the Sarin Collective, a civilization that communicated primarily through coordinated bioluminescence, and had attended 6 days of acoustic negotiation, with the patient forbearance of people at a concert whose instrument they do not play, lit up in a pattern that the implants identified as the rough equivalent of "please, someone, make it stop." Oliver's comm unit vibrated again. Then again. Then in a continuous pattern he had previously only associated with genuinely critical structural emergencies. There were 11 new messages from Earth's Foreign Affairs Office. He read them in sequence and discovered they formed a kind of narrative arc, beginning with "please clarify the nature of the Oliver situation," progressing through "we have convened an emergency subcommittee to review applicable protocol," passing through "the subcommittee has concluded there is no applicable protocol and will now draft one," and arriving finally at "we have assigned a working group to review the subcommittee's conclusions which are themselves under review," which meant that Earth had been made aware of a situation requiring immediate decisive action, and had responded by creating 3 layers of administrative review that would produce recommendations for action at a speed best described as geological. Petra read the messages over his shoulder without comment. Then she said, "The working group has 17 members. Same number as the objections. I don't think that means anything." "I know," Oliver said. "It's just nice to have a pattern." Earth had been joined by Objection 14, by 4 additional delegations. The Kale's closest trading partners, who had maintained careful neutrality through 6 days of open hostilities, and had now concluded that whatever was happening represented a threat to their interests significant enough to override that neutrality. This was, Oliver understood, a meaningful development. It meant the situation had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a failed negotiation or a diplomatic incident or even, technically, a joke. It had become the specific shape of something that frightened people with a strategic investment in things staying broken, which was the closest that intergalactic politics ever got to a proof of concept. Petra had clearly reached the same conclusion, because she opened a new document on her data slate and began typing with the focused velocity she reserved for communications that would eventually be entered into the historical record, and which she therefore wanted to be very certain reflected well on her professional judgment throughout. "Whatever you're going to do," she said, without looking up, "you should know that 4 delegations just filed co-objection status, which means Earth now has institutional backing, which means this is real. Whatever this is. It is now real." Oliver looked at her. "When was it not real?" Petra considered this. "The first 30 seconds, she said. "After that it was real and I was just hoping it wasn't." Above him, Objection 15 was being read by the hall's administrative intelligence with its characteristic undisturbed calm, and it concerned the potential gravitational symbolism of a human presence on the Velthari throne dais, which was both the most abstract and most telling objection yet, because it meant Earth had moved past procedural resistance into something more fundamental. The fear not of a union but of what a union meant, which was alignment. And what alignment meant, which was the end of the specific geopolitical imbalance on which the Kale Confederation's border claims had rested for 60 years. Oliver had read enough political history to know what this felt like. It felt like the moment before the moment, the held breath before the word, the particular weight of a room that has run out of things to talk about except the thing no one has yet said. He looked at Valentina. She was watching him, not with the broad, composed attention she had given the chamber all week, but with something smaller and more direct, the expression he had learned to read on a different scale, in a small stone room by amber lantern light. She was watching him the way a person watches when they already know what they are hoping for and have decided to let it resolve on its own terms. He understood then that the only move left was the one that couldn't be filed under objection, the one Earth had no administrative framework for, the one that had no precedent in any compact or treaty or supplementary annex written before Earth had even found its way off its own planet. He would have to stand up again. And this time, it would have to be true. Oliver stood up for the second time in the Grand Assembly Hall of Arrows 7 and the room noticed in a different way than it had the first time. The first time, his rising had produced shock, the instinctive attention given to something unexpected. This time the attention was slower and quieter, and had the quality of a room that has been waiting for something without quite knowing what it was waiting for, and has just understood. He did not have prepared remarks. He had not had them the first time either, but the first time that had been an accident. This time it was a choice, which made it considerably more frightening, and he supposed considerably more honest. "I want to say something," he said, which was how his grandmother had always begun when she was about to tell the truth to someone who had not asked for it, and which had always worked, because it gave the listener one sentence to decide whether they were ready. The chamber gave him that sentence. "I'm not a senior delegate," he continued. "I'm the third-ranking member of a three-person team, two of whom are currently experiencing what we are calling resonance fatigue, and what I am privately calling better judgment than mine. I was sent here because someone had to be, which is the least inspiring reason to attend a peace summit I am aware of, although looking at the last 6 days, I suspect most of us can say something similar." A sound moved through the chamber, not laughter exactly, but the sharp involuntary exhalation of a room that has recognized itself in something it did not expect. "We have been here for 6 days, Oliver said, and in 6 days I have heard prepared statements, formal objections, counter-proposals, supplementary annexes, procedural motions, and 17 objections, one of which was specifically about chairs." He looked at Urath, who emitted a low frequency his implant rendered as dignified silence, which was the tone translator's heroic best effort at the situation. "I have not heard, in 6 days, a single person say what they actually want, what they actually fear, what they are actually protecting." The hall was very still. "I said something stupid yesterday," he said. "I said it because I was frustrated and tired, and because I have been sitting in a chair designed for a species with 9 vertebral clusters for nearly a week, and it has not improved my judgment. It was also the most honest thing said in this room since the negotiations began, not because it was wise, because it wasn't planned. It came from somewhere real, and I think the room responded to it because real things are so rare in here that we've forgotten what they feel like." He had not looked at Valentina since he stood. He looked at her now. "The Kale Confederation is afraid that peace means losing the advantage they've held for 60 years in the neutral corridor. That's real. The Velthari sovereignty is tired, 300 years of conflict tired, and they want it to end. That's real. Earth is very far away and very confused about the paperwork situation, and that is also real." He heard Petra make a sound beside him. "What isn't real is the idea that 17 procedural objections are about jurisdiction. They're about fear, and I understand fear. I stood up in front of 1,000 people and said the most professionally catastrophic thing I have ever said because I was afraid that we were all going to leave this room having wasted 6 days, and not one of us would have tried anything that actually cost us something." The silence that followed was the third different kind of silence the chamber had produced in 2 days, and it was the most substantial. It had the weight of a room that has been told something it already knew and has been waiting for permission to admit. Then Valentina rose. She had risen twice before in this chamber, and each time the room had recalibrated around her. This time the recalibration was total and immediate. She stood at the height of the rotunda in the amber light, and she spoke with the quiet certainty that needed no amplification, because it had no uncertainty to compensate for. She spoke for 22 minutes. Oliver's implants delivered every word with perfect fidelity, and later he would try to describe it to Petra, and find that the most accurate thing he could say was that it sounded like someone finally putting down something that had been very heavy for a very long time. She named what the Velthari wanted plainly and without ceremony. She named what they would give. She addressed the Kale's border concerns with a directness that transformed them from grievances into soluble problems. She said, at one point, that the continued existence of 17 procedural objections, including one about chairs, was precisely the kind of thing that happened when reasonable beings spent too long in rooms designed for unreasonable outcomes. And something moved through the hall that was, unmistakably, laughter. Urath was still for a long time after she finished. Then his tone translator produced something the implants rendered, after a brief processing pause, as reluctant recognition, which was the most Kale a thing could sound while still technically constituting agreement. The Arrow's accords were drafted in 3 hours by a committee working with the focused efficiency of people who had collectively decided they had been in this hall long enough. The hall's administrative intelligence, which had processed 900 years of proceedings without opinion, produced the final document with what Oliver could only describe as archival satisfaction, the way a very old building settles when something right has happened inside it. Petra co-signed for Earth with the expression of someone who has no idea what she will put in her report, but has decided that accuracy is a problem for the version of herself that exists next week. Objections 1 through 17 were formally withdrawn by Urath at the close of session without explanation. Oliver did not ask for one. Some things are cleaner without a ceremony. Earth's Foreign Affairs Office sent a final message as the session closed. It read, "We have concluded the Oliver situation is political and personal and will file accordingly. Please advise on the paperwork." The working group had apparently reached a finding. Oliver put his comm unit face down on the table and left it there. The delegates of 100 worlds filed out of the rotunda through corridors that had not seen this particular kind of exiting in the hall's recorded history, quiet and unhurried, not the retreat of failure. The amber lanterns burned on without comment, as they had for 3,000 years, with the equanimity of things that have witnessed enough to be unsurprised by the good as well as the bad. Oliver was still standing at his station when Valentina crossed the chamber floor and stopped in front of him. The attendants had gone. Petra had gone, tactfully, and with the considerate precision of a person who has excellent instincts and has chosen this particular moment to exercise all of them at once. "You used Velthas," Valentina said, "without using the word." "I've had time to think about it," Oliver said. "You had approximately 4 hours. I'm a fast thinker when I'm panicking." The negative space where a smile had been considering its position for several days finally resolved into the actual thing, and it was, Oliver thought, entirely worth the wait. "You said something real," she said, "in front of 1,000 people. That is considerably harder than saying it by accident." "Don't tell my government that," Oliver said. "They'll want to train people to do it on purpose, and the whole point is that it doesn't work that way." "No," Valentina agreed, "it doesn't." They walked out together into the corridor that overlooked open space, where the twin moons of the Velthari sovereignty hung in the dark the way they always had, cold and constant and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in the hall below them. The neutral corridor of Arrows 7 stretched in all directions, belonging to no one, and for the first time in 6 days, the recycled air smelled only of itself. Oliver looked at the moons and then at Valentina beside him, and thought about honest accidents and honest choices and the smaller distance between them than he had previously understood. He did not say any of this. He had said enough true things for one day. But she was standing close enough that the faint luminescence of her starsilk moved in the same cold light as the stars beyond the glass, and neither of them moved to leave. And the corridor held them in the quiet the way the hall's stone had held the amber light for 3,000 years, without demanding anything, without explaining anything, simply making room for something that had decided, on its own terms and without preparation to be. Behind them, the ancient lanterns burned on. There is a version of Oliver that never stood up. He exists somewhere in the vast branching space of every decision not made, sitting quietly in his ergonomically hostile chair, drafting the apology statement, filing out of the rotunda with 1,000 other delegates into the cold corridor of a moon that belongs to no one, carrying his 4 years of education, and his 6 languages and his profound, unspoken admiration for a woman on a dark matter, thrown back across 4 light years to a planet that would never know what almost happened. The war continues in that version. The neutral corridor stays contested. The amber lanterns burn on in an empty hall, patient as they have always been, waiting for someone to finally say something true. He exists, but he is not the version that matters. What the story keeps asking, long after the accords are signed and the lanterns burn and the twin moons hold their cold position in the dark, is not whether Oliver was brave. He wasn't, particularly. He was tired and frustrated and running on ceremonial tea, and the specific kind of recklessness that arrives when you have stopped protecting yourself and haven't yet decided what to do instead. What the story keeps asking is something quieter and more personal than bravery. It asks what you have been meaning to say, not in a hall of 1,000 delegates, not across the floor of an ancient rotunda with the weight of interstellar history pressing down from every tier, just in the ordinary rooms of your own life, the things you have filtered through calculation until they no longer resemble themselves, the honest accidents you chose not to have, the has you swallowed because the moment felt too large or too small or too uncertain, or because you were simply afraid that if you said the real thing might be answered, and then what? Then it becomes real. Then you have to live inside it. Valentina listened to a joke and heard a truth because she had stopped believing that truth arrived announced. Most of us are waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right circumstances, as though honesty is something that requires favorable conditions rather than simply the willingness to stop editing yourself long enough to mean something. The negotiation that almost destroyed everything was saved not by expertise or strategy or the careful architecture of prepared remarks. It was saved by one person, in one moment, dropping the script entirely and saying the thing that was actually inside him, imperfect, unvetted, professionally catastrophic, and completely real. What is the thing inside you that you have not yet said? Not the version of it you have refined until it is safe. The original thing, the Velthas, the honest accident waiting to happen if you would only stop preventing it. The Hall of Arrows 7 had burned its lanterns for 3,000 years waiting for that moment. It is worth asking, quietly and without pressure, how long you have been burning yours. This story ends here, friends. As a reward for our efforts, please like the story, leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Sci-Fi Traveler so you don't miss our next story. See you in the next episode. Take care. Goodbye.